The Iranian hostage crisis began on November 4, 1979, when a group of Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran, Iran. Frustrated with the corruption in their government, Iranian revolutionaries wanted to hold someone accountable for years of incompetent leadership under their Shah. Iranians suspected that the Shah was supported by President Jimmy Carter, which fueled their hatred against the United States. When the Shah sought temporary refuge in the United States for treatment of terminal cancer, Iranian rebels lashed out and took 52 Americans hostage.
At the beginning of his presidency, Carter was very welcoming to the Shah, as both he and the American people were blissfully unaware of the Shah's declining approval ratings and the very present threat of revolution in Iran. Few Americans knew what was going on between the United States and Iran because local newspapers did not cover news from outside their community. This changed drastically after the hostages were taken, as media outlets immediately capitalized on the crisis, updating the American public about the beloved hostages daily. Despite the American public's initial support for Carter's response to the crisis, opinionated and partially inaccurate media accounts criticized Carter's foreign policy, increasing patriotism amongst Americans, yet subsequently leading to his defeat in the election of 1980.
The media's overly dramatic interpretation of the crisis, coupled with Carter's failed rescue attempt, caused the American public's initial support for Carter to wane due to suspicion of his incompetence and questionable personal motivations. In Carter's State of the Union address, he directed the nation with goals to protect the interests of the United States and secure the safe relief of the American hostages. Carter begged the American public to unite in support of the hostages, assuring them that, quote, patience is a sign of sure strength, end quote. Carter's approval rating subsequently increased from 32% to 61%. While they were initially confident in his unwavering foreign policy, American citizens soon urged Carter to make safety his primary concern, focusing on action rather than fearing the consequences.
Americans became worried that he would not take a firm or drastic enough measure to bring the hostages home, struggling to see past the dramatic, heart-wrenching portrayals of the captives and their mourning families on television. American television networks placed their resources at the service of the Iranian captors, faithfully recording their gestures and shouts each day at the appointed assembly hour near the embassy, while the captors shook their fists with contrived ferocity at the camera lens.
It's hard to describe the atmosphere outside that embassy every single day. There were hundreds, sometimes thousands of Iranians protesting, demonstrating, screaming death to America in front of the TV cameras. But most of the time, they were just standing around having a good time.
The media's dramatic portrayal of the crisis deterred support from Carter, as Americans struggled to understand how such a tragedy could befall their country with little progress made in negotiations.
Political tension was heightened after American helicopters broke down during a failed rescue attempt in April 1980. Increasingly outraged Americans pressured Carter into recklessly attempting to rescue the hostages. Carter's administration held press conferences about the failed rescue mission, but the media's incessant coverage surpassed Carter's attempts to reconcile the mistake. Images depicting the mechanical failure of the burning helicopters and the gruesome remains of an American pilot were released to the public, plastered on the covers of newspapers and tabloid magazines. Carter was marked by both the Iranian captors who saw him as weak and the American people who were losing faith in his capabilities as a leader. The failed rescue mission represented a turning point where many of those who at first supported Carter became disillusioned by his policies.
The media's widely televised accounts of the crisis made news accessible to many people, increasing patriotic sentiments among the American public as citizens were united in their desire to bring the hostages home safely. The media's coverage of the crisis was fervently consumed by the American public as people turned to shows like ABC Nightline's The Iran Crisis, America Held Hostage, each night for updates on negotiations. On ABC, Ted Koppel reported daily, endlessly detailing the latest developments.
The crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now. But throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom. That search was not successful today.
On CBS, Walter Cronkite, a popular and trusted reporter, pressured Carter to speed up negotiations by signing off his newscast each night with the number of days the hostages had been held in captivity. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of Iranians would protest outside the embassy each day, knowing the footage would be broadcast to American televisions each night. Carter's administration faced multiple press leaks to publications like Newsweek, rumoring progress in negotiations or rescue attempts. Developments in Iran and speculation about government policies dominated the news.
Many Americans reacted to the emotional media coverage of the hostage crisis on a personal level. Heartbreaking television interviews with the families of the hostages became a dramatic source of entertainment. The families of the hostages immediately addressed their fellow citizens through the media, urging them not to protest and insisting that Americans remain united in the face of terrorism. Churches throughout the nation held special masses to honor the hostages. Many American families pinned yellow ribbons to their doors as a declaration of their unwavering support.
The widespread personal reactions contributed to a sense of ideological unity that transcended divisions among American citizens. Due to constant reminders from the media, the plight of the hostages quickly became a national obsession. The American people were united on an issue for the first time in decades, as the country was left divided after the Vietnam War. In its Man of the Year cover story in January 1980, Time magazine acknowledged that, quote, "the shock of seeing the U.S. flag burned on the streets of Tehran or misused by embassy attackers to carry trash jolted our nation out of its self-doubting Vietnam syndrome," end quote. Americans became as familiar with the face of Iran's leader Khomeini as they were with that of President Carter. Ordinary Americans soon became experts, rattling off exotic names of Iranian captors to demonstrate their knowledge about the topic. Across the nation, Americans were burning Iranian flags in the streets and refusing to eat Iranian caviar, determined to use individual action to send a message to the captors. Many Americans were eager to go to war to protect their people. When the hostages were released, Americans proudly gathered in town centers and at airports, waving American flags and yellow ribbons.
While campaigning for the election of 1980, Carter faced primarily negative and critical media attention, which contributed to his loss to Ronald Reagan and his legacy as a weak president. Carter initially established a Rose Garden strategy against his Republican opponent Ronald Reagan, in which he refrained from campaigning while the hostages were still in captivity. He struggled to strike a balance between being politically strategic in regard to the election and humane in regard to the safe and timely return of the hostages. Carter abandoned this policy after barely winning the Democratic nomination over Ted Kennedy. Even after he began campaigning, he spent much of the fall of 1980 trying to account for his time lost. Carter also faced malicious television commercials that attacked his record and exaggerated his mistakes and shortcomings.
The Carter administration feared that, if compromise was reached, many would criticize the concessions made to Iran in return for a timely release of the hostages. Many Americans suspected that Carter was trying to manipulate the hostage crisis in the weeks leading up to the election in order to increase his chances of success. Carter understood that he had to be both a symbolic representation of freedom and a tough negotiator capable of asserting American dominance over the terrorists. However, each day the 52 Americans remained captive, the Carter administration looked more confused and unproductive. Iranians used Carter's dilemma as leverage in their negotiations, aware that he was hopeful for a pre-election popularity boost. The revolutionaries were vocal against Carter, warning that if Americans wanted to have good relations with Iran, they must vote him out of office and elect a suitable president.
In the televised presidential debates between Carter and Reagan, Reagan called the crisis a humiliation to American strength. Unfortunately for Carter, the election date coincided with the one-year anniversary of the hostage crisis, which was influential in the minds of the voters as they realized how little progress Carter had made after a year. Carter's chief of staff recollected that on the day before the election, quote, "all three major networks concluded not with stories about the impending presidential election, but with a commemoration of the anniversary of the captivity. The news was a strong reminder of our inability after a long year to win an honorable release of the hostages," end quote. In a strong victory, Reagan defeated Carter in the election, leaving Carter a one-term president with a poor record. On Inauguration Day, remnants of the tragedy continued to plague Carter as American television screens were split, half showing Washington, the other a live feed from Tehran. Eyewitnesses depicted Carter as haggard and worn, implying that his attempts and failures over the past 2 years aged and defeated him. Strategically planned by their Iranian captors, the hostages were released minutes after Reagan was inaugurated to spite Carter. This was considered the first success of Reagan's presidency, even though the negotiations were carried out under Carter. Reagan became a symbolic image of freedom, providing hope for a stronger America no longer plagued by the hostage crisis.
Carter's victory went essentially unnoticed by the American public, as his efforts looked subordinate to Reagan's when they both traveled to West Germany to meet the hostages. Even after the hostages were freed, the public continued to associate Iran with terrorism and violence. The gruesome portrayal of the crisis turned the public against Iran until the present day.